Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be back in the UK. So thank you for inviting us. Thank you for the organizer, Spectra, John, and everyone here for this opportunity. Let me begin with a question. Oops, is this work? What if the rivers could speak? What would it tell us? Maybe it would say, I'm not just water. I carry soil from the hill slopes, sediments, nutrients from forests, and memories of every community I pass. I feed farms, I give water to homes, I shape cities, I connect ecosystems from headwaters to coasts. But maybe some river would say, I am struggling. I am being narrowed, mined, straightened, channelized, and treated as a problem to be fixed. I am asked to carry more water, more sediments, more waste, and more risk, often with less space than before. And when I flood, people say I failed. People see this as a failure. But perhaps the real question is whether we have failed to understand how rivers work. And this is the central idea of my talk today. Flooding is not always a problem. Flooding is a natural river process. The problem is when rivers lose the space they need, when communities and infrastructure are placed in exposed areas, and when rivers processes are disrupted by decisions made over many years, as John mentioned. So today, I focus not on defeating floods, but on understanding how flood risk is produced across the catchment and how we can manage it more fairly, more scientifically, and more sustainably. I will be talking with you about rethinking flood risk and river management in the Philippines, a catchment scale perspective, listening to rivers as dynamic and connected systems. But before I go further, let me ask who here has been to the Philippines? Wow, that's nice. Well, I don't need to introduce you where the Philippines is. It's pretty much there, but it's about the size of the UK and Republic of Ireland together. I mean, roughly the same. But you know in what aspect the Philippines is number one at? Any guess?
Number one, what?
No, in what aspect the Philippines is number one at? What are we number one at? When I asked this question in New Zealand, they told me malls, mangoes, food. Yes, we accept that, but yes.
Beautiful woman.
Beautiful women. Oh, I'll accept that. Yeah, so then, yes. Thank you. Of course, any guess? But typhoons, yes, part of it. And sadly, we've been named as the country with the highest disaster risk worldwide. Not once, not twice, not even thrice, but 4 times in a row now. Unlike the UK, the Philippines is located in the Western Pacific, directly in path of the tropical cyclones. It sits within a region shaped by monsoons, typhoons, earthquakes, volcanoes, steep mountains, short, steep river basins, dense coastal settlements, and rapidly growing urban areas. So when we talk about flood risk in the Philippines, we are talking about a country where hazard exposure is very high, but also where vulnerability and governance challenges make risk especially difficult to manage. So flooding in the Philippines is not an occasional disruption. For many communities, it is a recurring condition. Risk is also produced by decisions where we build, how we design infrastructure, how we manage rivers, how budgets are allocated, and whether projects are based on science and accountability. As mentioned by John, recent debates around flood control projects in the Philippines have made this painfully clear. When I went home last year, the flood control fiasco was all over the news. It opened a Pandora's box and put a spotlight not only on corruption, but also on deeper questions about how flood management projects are planned, justified, implemented, and evaluated. The scale is enormous. The finance secretary estimated that around 118.5 billion pesos or 1.43 billion pounds may have been lost, an amount equivalent to hundreds of thousands of jobs per year. But beyond the financial loss, there is a scientific and policy questions. Are these projects actually reducing flood risk? Are they based on the behavior of the river system? And are they assessed beyond the project site across the catchment? So flooding is not only a climate issue, it is also a governance issue. And for this talk, I want to add, it is also a river management issue. In the Philippines, we have invested heavily on flood control. We build dikes, levees, flood walls, drainage systems, river training structures, and other hard engineering interventions. And yet, flooding continues. These are photos taken in November last year after the onslaught of Typhoon Tino, the typhoon that dumped over a month's rainfall in just 24 hours. So this is not simply a question of more infrastructure. It raises a more difficult question. Are our solutions aligned with how the river responds to rainfall? Dikes can work locally, but they are incomplete when treated as a whole strategy. And this is where the river perspective comes in. Rivers are not fixed system. They move, they adjust, they transport sediment, and yes, they connect upstream to downstream. So what we see in one location is often driven by processes somewhere else. I remember watching the news during a typhoon that had not even fully left the Philippines. Flooding was still very much happening, and a mayor was already saying, "We will build dikes and dredge the river." I understand why that sounds reassuring. It is visible, decisive, and concrete. But the problem is treating this as universal solutions, but no two rivers are alike. This is where pluvial morphology matters. Each river has its own character, and that character actually shapes how it behaves. And if we recognize this, we can anticipate how they respond to interventions and allow us to design solutions that work with the river. So maybe you can imagine one person going to the doctor's office and then ask, okay, these are my symptoms, and the doctor won't ask him any of his symptoms, but will give him paracetamol. So this is how we're treating our rivers. We will build dikes and dredge without knowing what causes the problem, what's the source of the problem. And this is why for flood risk as a catchment process, extreme rainfall may be the trigger, but the disaster footprint is shaped by the river system. So you can see here, rainfall falls on hill slopes produce runoff and sediment. Land use changes how quickly water and sediment move or deliver to the river. Channel modification changes how the river conveys flow. Floodplain exposure determines who and what is in harm's way. And governance decisions shape where interventions happen, who benefits, and where is risk transferred. So the flood we see in one location is not only a local drainage issue, it is the result of processes interacting across space and time. That means our management questions also have to change. Instead of asking only how do we stop flooding here, we need to ask how is the catchment producing this flood risk? Where is sediment coming from? Where does the river need space? Which intervention reduce risk and which one simply move it elsewhere? And this is the central proposition of the talk. A catchment-scale perspective changes what counts as evidence, what counts as a solution, and who needs to be involved in river management. To support this argument, I'll draw on a series of research outputs that each reveal a different a part of the flood risk system. And these are outputs of my PhD and the Catchment Project, a collaborative project between the University of Glasgow and the University of the Philippines. Some operate at the national scale, showing the diversity and mobility of Philippine rivers, and others focus on the Bislak catchment, where we can examine how human interventions such as confinement, quarrying, and flood control structures change river behavior in detail. Let's begin with our first research topic, the National Scale Geodatabase of Catchment Characteristics of River Management Applications. The first piece of evidence comes from our national scale geodatabase. Across the Philippines, rivers vary enormously. Some are short, steep mountain torrents. Others are large lowland rivers with wide floodplains. Some drain volcanic landscapes. Others pass through alluvial valleys or coastal plains. The motivation was to understand Philippine rivers not as isolated sites, but as interconnected systems that operate within diverse landscapes and climatic settings. Each catchment was characterized by variables such as area, elevation, slope, and gradient, all of which influence flow. So you can access this geodatabase using the QR code or the link there. And the database can be used to reveal the differences and similarities between catchments at a national scale. Shown here, for example, the average stream slope. So you can see that some western catchments in the western area of the Philippines have higher slope than the average stream slope in the Philippines. And we can also use this to compare the characteristics of adjacent catchments, how similar or how different they are. So this database helps us move away from one-size-fits-all flood management. It allows agencies, local governments, researchers, and communities to ask what kind of catchment are we dealing with? And yes, where might infrastructure be exposed? And this is the first layer of the catchment scale argument. Before we manage rivers, we need to know what kinds of river systems we have. Once we can see the diversity in Philippine catchments at the national scale, the next question is, what kind of flood risk strategies are appropriate for such diverse river systems? This leads to the second output, which explores natural flood management in tropical Southeast Asia, prospects in the biodiverse nation and of the Philippines. Globally, countries like the UK, Netherlands, and Japan integrate nature-based solutions into flood management, but research and adoption in Southeast Asia remain limited. Given our high flood risk, as shown in the maps here, map at the top shows population exposed to high flood risk, where you can see the dark colors are concentrated in the tropical Southeast Asia. And at the bottom, we see a map showing population with high flood risk and poor. And we still see that high percentage of population in tropical Southeast Asia. It is then crucial to have an alternative strategy to explore nature-based as a sustainable adaptive alternative to traditional flood control. But aside from having high exposure and lack of capacity to adapt, key challenges includes extreme weather and flooding, typhoons, monsoons, heavy rainfall cause frequent and severe floods, land use changes, deforestation, urbanization, and agriculture increase flood vulnerability, weak institutional frameworks, policies are fragmented, making coordinated management difficult, reliance on structural interventions, dams, levees dominate, but they, of course, not all, but often fails long-term. Short-term projects and limited expertise. Many projects lack sustainability and technical capacity and public perception. So nature-based remains under utilized due to lack of awareness and policy integration. In terms of management and application of the concept of respecting river diversity, steering away from one-size-fits-all solution, this diagram shows prospects of catchment-scale natural flood management in Southeast Asia. It is like a menu of nature-based strategies that can be implemented in the Philippines and elsewhere that work with each river style based on their position in the catchment. So we divided the catchment into 4 nested, connected parts. Managing headwaters as sponges, one key nature-based solution is protecting and managing headwaters as natural sponges, as they have the greatest potential to reduce flood log times and volumes. The main goals of the strategies here are retaining water in the upper watershed, slowing down runoff to reduce downstream flooding, minimizing soil erosion to maintain river stability, and the strategies include headwater drainage management such as erosion protection, leaky barriers, tension ponds, and reforestation. And by implementing conservation strategies in headwater areas, we enhance resilience to flooding and drought. Midstream of a catchment is where a river transitions from a steep upland and to lowland landscape. Compared to headwaters, reaches in the mid catchment have a higher stream order, greater width, higher discharge, and geomorphic units in this transport zone are typically more prone to change than units in headwaters. Another crucial approach is restoring river width to maintain natural flow patterns. This means reconnecting rivers to their floodplains and creating space for water to spread out, reducing flood risk. So many traditional interventions like concrete embankments restrict river movement and exacerbate problems, and instead, floodplain restoration allows rivers to function naturally, improving both ecological health and flood resilience. People in the Philippines have a strong affinity to water. Indeed, the largest cultural linguistic group, Tagalog, derived its name from the words Taga-ilog. I saw John smiling, which means river dwellers or from the river. Anthropogenic activities impacting river systems are typically highest in urban areas, where rivers are treated as an entity to be controlled. In contemporary urban settings in the Philippines, impermeable surfaces such as roads, pavements, and roofs reduce infiltration, thus increasing runoff during storm events. However, riverscape restoration and creation of blue, water, and green, such as land and vegetation spaces, provide opportunities for stormwater storage and increasing rainfall runoff lag times. So, urban environments present unique challenges for flood risk management. Blue-green infrastructure integrates natural elements into cities by enhancing water retention through green spaces and wetlands, reducing flood risk by improving drainage systems, and providing co-benefits like improved air quality and biodiversity. The interface between fluvial and coastal systems is often a nexus for natural hazards, where joint probabilities of fluvial and coastal flood events need to be considered, and where communities can be at risk from flooding with fluvial, coastal, and or combined fluvial coastal sources. So in these regions, maintaining and creating space for water is essential to mitigate flood risk. And here we can do estuarine restoration, like seagrass planting and mangrove restoration, coral reef rehab, resort to natural barriers such as brushwoods, done in Indonesia, I think, and rather than concrete one, and land use planning, which can also involve decreasing the risk of vulnerable communities through relocation. So National Flood Risk Management, or NPS, requires collaboration across agencies and communities. It relies not only on engineering, but also on governance, planning, and public engagement. So as we show in the study, working with nature is not just environmentally sound, it is practical and cost-effective for building long-term resilience. The next output looks at river mobility. One of the most important things to understand about rivers is that they move. Some rivers migrate laterally across their valleys, some expand meander bends, some cut off channels, some shift between multiple threads, others are confined by walls and remain relatively stable. But even within the same river system, mobility can vary dramatically from one reach to another. This matters because management strategies must reflect the river's capacity to adjust. If a river is naturally mobile, then trying to freeze it in one place may require constant intervention and may create new problems. And if a river is naturally confined, then we are looking more about vertical incision, sediment transport, and energy concentration. Across the Philippines, the riverscapes have been heavily altered. all tried to control flow and sediments, as we mentioned earlier. Yet, despite this modification, our analysis shows that rivers remain remarkably dynamic. They continue to reshape their valleys, defying rigid control. Here are two rivers you've seen at the beginning. One on the top is a Bislak River out in the north of the Philippines, and at the bottom is the Grand River, or one of our largest river in the country. Using Google Earth image, we stopped up every Landsat satellite image from 1988 to 2019 to analyze how the 10 largest rivers in the Philippines have changed. These techniques let rivers speak to us to tell us how they have changed. We hear a lot about big data, and I think this is a really useful demonstration of its application. Different styles of river adjust in different ways over differing timescales. And these maps of channel change use locational probability to show channel location where the channel doesn't move every much. The area it occupies is yellow. So those in yellow are more stable and those in blue are less stable, where there's rapid movement. We analyzed 10 rivers in the Philippines on how they move side to side across their valleys through time. And what we found is that rivers don't shift evenly along their lengths. Instead, they have patches that are quite stable and other sections that move a lot. In other words, some parts of the river stay put for decades, while nearby sections can migrate dramatically, underscoring the need for reach-specific management and not one-size-fits-all approaches. So the implications are really clear by identifying which segments are naturally mobile. Managers can design buffer zones, take infrastructure more safely, and prioritize floodplain restoration where adjustment is inevitable. So rather than constraining rivers, we can plan for their movement, turning geomorphic understanding of the rivers into practical risk-reducing policy. River mobility matters because much of our critical infrastructure is located near rivers. This is where geomorphology and infrastructure intersect. Bridges are especially important in the Philippines. The National Road Network carries a very large share of passenger and freight transport, and bridges often provide the only connection between communities. But bridges are also vulnerable. They are exposed not only to floodwater, but also to erosion, scouring, sediment movements, and channel migration in one of the world's most remarkably active landscapes. In this work, we use the National Bridge Database of the Department of Public Works and Highways and focus on large bridges crossing active river channels. Then, using Google Earth Engine, we developed an automated workflow to map river transforms across multiple decades. So by overlaying satellite images from different time periods, we measured how much the river had shifted relative to its previous position. This gave us a standardized way to describe how stable or mobile each bridge site was over roughly 30 years, the typical design lifespan of bridges in the Philippines, of major river bridges in the Philippines. And the results show that half of the the Jacquard index was 0.5, meaning that half of the active channel area near bridges had changed position over 3 decades. So imagine if we integrate this into designing these bridges. But yes, of course, not all bridges face the same risk. Some sites show very little movement while others experience significant channel migration. So again, reflecting the diversity of river behaviors in the Philippines. And from a management standpoint, these results highlight the need to integrate these data into bridge design and maintenance. And engineers can use this information to identify which sites are more exposed to river migration. And yes, they can prioritize inspections in these sites. Okay, are you still with me? Okay, bear with me again. Last three or four. Understanding where rivers move is one part of infrastructure risk. Another part is knowing how much water infrastructure must be designed to withstand. Here is research output 5, integrating historical archives and geospatial data to revise flood estimation and equations for Philippine rivers. I'm not sure if what's the case in other parts of Southeast Asia, but flood, of course, especially challenging in the Philippines because long continuous river flow records are limited. Many catchments are engaged or poorly gauged. Monitoring stations may have short records, missing data, or discontinuous operation. Yet, flood estimation is essential for, as we saw, bridge design, flood defenses, and other infrastructure. So, in this output, we integrated historical hydrological archives way back in 1908. I'm not sure if that's old enough, but we were surprised to see this 4 volumes of discharge data and modern geospatial data to improve flood estimation equations for Philippine rivers. So here we just pull and gathered sets of historical flow records, and we merged these sources and we were able to construct a more robust picture of historical river behavior and flood frequency that could inform future planning. From a management perspective, it is also important to decide which flood return period should be used for different planning. So, for example, the 100-year flood or Q100 is often used as a standard design flood. However, it may not always be necessary for every situation. So these new equations can improve the design standards for bridges, flood defenses, and water infrastructure, ensuring that they are resilient under both current and future climate conditions. But national patterns only take us so far. To understand how flood risk is produced through specific interactions between river form, sediment infrastructure, and human activity, we need to zoom in. So now I turn to the Bislak Catchment in northern Luzon. This is my favorite river. So, do you have any favorite rivers?
Yes.
Thames. Okay, this is Bislak Catchment. It is located northeastern of the Philippines. The next three research output looks at Bislak Catchment, and here we zoom in from national scale analysis to a single tropical catchment. And our goal here was to classify the different styles of rivers, interpret how they are controlled by landscape and geology, and explore what this means for sustainable management. So as you can see, it doesn't look the same in different parts of the river. And the key point here is that river diversity does not only exist between catchment, but it also exists within catchments. Within one river system, we may find steep, confined headwaters, gorges, partly confined reaches, and deltaic areas. So each of these has different behavior, different sensitivity to disturbance, and different management needs. So to understand this diversity, we apply the river styles framework. It is a geomorphological approach that classifies rivers based on their character and behavior. It asks, what type of river is this? How does it behave? What controls its form? And how has it changed? And what is its capacity for adjustment and recovery? So we start by characterizing the regional and catchment context. This stage helps us understand how natural setting influence river behavior. We identified 8 different river styles in Bislak. Bislak is not even one of the major river basins in the country, but here we have identified 8 different river styles. And this is important because each river type needs a different management approach, as I have mentioned again and again. We also look at downstream patterns. As rivers move from headwaters to lowlands, they pass through different landscapes, landscape units, slopes, lithology, sediment regimes. Here we identified 5 downstream patterns, and these transitions help explain why certain river styles occur where they do, and this allows us to understand catchments as a connected sequence. So the river styles analysis gives us a foundation for catchment scale management. It helps us identify where to protect natural river forms and where restoration may be possible, where sediment processes are important and where floods may be coming from. But the natural diversity of the Bislak River is only part of the story. The river is also being controlled or modified by human activities, especially confinement and aggregate extraction. Now we'll look at the human activities, the confined and mined anthropogenic river modification as a driver of flood risk. Flood risk change examines how river confinement and sand and gravel extraction affect river dynamics and flood risk. This is important because in many parts of the Philippines, river sediments are extracted for construction materials. At the same time, river banks are often confined by protection structures and bankings. And to understand the consequences, we need to think about sediment balance. This is the only fluvial morphology concept. This is actually the problem I want to look at. One geomorphological concept. It is one of the most important diagrams in fluvial geomorphology. Lane's balance shows how a river may respond to changes in water and or sediment flux. It's a balance. The needle shows change, bed aggregation. Degradation is lowering, aggregation is raising. So for example, two scenarios, climate change, more water. So more water will lead to bed degradation because it will scour the bed. While sediments such as additional sediment supplies such as landslides, earthquakes, or volcanoes means more sediment, so the RO will aggregate, so the river will be raised. So when this balance is disturbed, say when we increase flow or reduce sediment supply through quarrying or levees, the river reacts. It can erode its bed and banks, deepen its channel, and compromise the infrastructure in the along the river. Again, sediments are what build and shape rivers, and they form bars, banks, and floodplains. So when we change how much sediment a river carries, it reshapes itself to adjust, often leading to erosion or instability. The historical maps show that, and the LiDAR surveys that produce very high resolution maps show the active channel has narrowed and changed over time. So and this channel was deepened between 1947 and 2020, a clear signature of incision and loss of lateral mobility. For further investigation, we used LiDAR from the DREAM project in 2014, and we also acquired high resolution maps in 2019 and 2020. And if we plot these together, we see that river isn't static. It changes from year to year. So here you barely see the changes, but if you plot this together, you can see that the bed changes. And we use a process known as dams of difference. So we just subtract elevation change is shown in two colors, erosion in red and deposition in blue. The results show patterns of erosion, deposition, and sediment removal. In some regions, erosion in red dominates, in others, sediment is moved through mining. In yellow, if you can see those small bars there. And together, these changes affect the river's sediment budget and flood behavior. And so confinement and quarrying are not only activities, local activities, they have system scale consequences. And so flooders may appear to decrease in one place, while infrastructure risk, erosion risk, or downstream risk increases elsewhere. This brings us to the final research output, which looks at specifically hard engineering structures and their cascading consequences. This is available online. I will just skip some slides. So here we have the cascading consequences of structural intervention in tropical South tropical wandering gravel bed river. Again, we see these structures here. So we analyzed 41 engineered structures, including levees, river steering walls, and draining distributed along the Bislak River. If you can see the red lines, and so this the present here shows that the presence of each structure or the structures increase both flow depth and velocity. In essence, by confining the river, we speed up the water, concentrating energy in narrow spaces, and this might sound beneficial for flood control, but it often shifts the problem downstream. As flow velocity rises, so does shear stress, which erodes the opposite bank or channel bed, transferring risk rather than reducing it. So the water is not disappearing; it's just being transferred somewhere else. Again, 41 structures were rated based on structure purpose. So this is way before the flood control fiasco happened. We've investigated the effect and effectiveness of these structures. And 25 structures were rated as 2 or 3, which suggests that they can be redesigned. Only one structure resulted to be removed. And further investigation, we saw that by confining the river, we concentrate energy into a narrow space that may help contain water during smaller events, but it can also increase erosion, shear stress, and sediment movement. So we saw the effect of this structure in the channel and banks, on flood depth and velocity, on shear stress and erodibility ratio. Now let's see what's happening landward. Structures installed can often give false sense of security to people. Its presence makes us believe that flood risk has been eliminated, leading to expansion of built-up areas landward of the structure, and increasing their flood exposure, a phenomenon called the levee effect. There is potential evidence happening in Windsor where a structure was built in 2017 and there has been an increase in residents behind the structure. So let me take you back to the study area. In 2017, this structure was constructed. We saw how it affected the erosion at the opposite bank. So this structure was constructed, and you know what happened in 2022? A structure was built and constructed, and we now see how rivers are being straightened because of one structure that's not supposed to be there. So these 5 points just summarize how sustainable river management means working with and not against natural processes and balancing structure, sediment, and local context for long-term resilience. Sweet. Let's pause here. I put this slide here partly for you, but mostly in river science, specifically in fluvial morphology, we often talk about giving more space to river, giving rivers room to move. At this point of the talk, I think we also need to give ourselves a room to process. So this is our floodplain moment. A little storage space before the next peak arrives. Inhale, before you inhale. Count to 8 for each research output and if you're and what I want to store from all these research output is this: flood risk is produced by connected processes. So management also has to become more connected. I will skip this slide. This is just a summary of how each research output fits into the management story. But this is where the institutional challenge becomes clear. Even if the science points us towards catchment-scale management, implementation is difficult because responsibilities are fragmented. Water resources, flood control, land use, environmental protection, infrastructure, disaster risk reduction, monitoring, permitting, and local development are often handled by different agencies and institutions. This slide illustrates that fragmentation. And this table shows how many institutions have partial mandates over the same river system. This creates several problems. First, interventions may be planned locally without understanding the catchment-wide effects. Second, agencies may work with different data, timelines, and objectives. Third, flood control may be separated from sediment management, may be separated from water quality, may be separated from land use planning and ecosystem restoration. And fourth, short project life cycles may favor visible structures over longer term monitoring, maintenance, and adaptive management. The challenge is not only technical, it is institutional. A catchment scale perspective requires not only better science, but also better coordination. Let's take Metro Manila, for instance. Metro Manila makes the governance problem visible. Flooding there is shaped by drainage, pumping station, floodways, housing, land use, solid waste, river rehabilitation, and disaster response. But all handled through different mandates, but water does not move according to institutional boundaries. It moves as one connected system. So after all the research outputs and government challenge, I want to return to a simpler idea. Rivers are not only hazards, but they are also infrastructure. But leaving infrastructure, if given enough space, it will rivers and floodplains can store water, convey floods, and help communities adapt to climate change. So these rivers here in the Philippines are not messy landscapes. They are rivers doing what rivers do, adjusting to water, to climate, and sediments. Too often, we only value rivers when they are controlled, straightened, or walled. But a river with space is not wasted. It is flood storage, it is sediment management, and it is ecological infrastructure and climate adaptation. So making space for rivers does not mean doing nothing. It means making smarter decisions about where to protect, where to restore, and where to avoid development, and where to let the river function as it should. So some key principles to close these presentations. Rivers are not problems to fix, but systems to work with. Each river is unique. Respect its diversity. What happens upstream affects downstream. Prevention saves more than repair. Communities are not just stakeholders, they are knowledge holders. So engage them, think beyond today. If we want a healthy future, we should take care of our rivers starting now. And yes, let's work together. These are some of the ways we have tried to translate our science into policy. Making space for Philippine River sets out 6 policy recommendations, such as some use the river mobility to review the legal easements zones in the Philippines. We also have this river managed catalog that brings together the 8 research outputs I have discussed today with 2 more papers on co-creating sustainable geomorphologically informed river futures and developing communities of river practitioners. And lastly, the position statement is our attempt to communicate in clearer language while living with rivers requires a different kind of management. And the message across these outputs is the same. If you want more resilient communities, we need to make space not only for water, but also for river processes that sustain landscapes, ecosystems, and livelihoods. But policy communication is only one step. The next challenge is assessment and implementation. And this is where ScanFlood comes in. So when I returned from the UK, I had planned to take a break, but because, PhD is really exhausting. Around the time, the flood control controversy in the Philippines was becoming a major national issue. An executive director asked me a very direct question: what should the science response be? And they sent my cascading consequences paper, the research output aid, and they asked me to propose a project. But I meant to say no. I think that's every PhD dream, to see your work be applied and relevant to the problem. And this is one of the projects, science-based comprehensive assessment of the nation's flood management project. When I first presented it, I called it scan flood, and they asked me, what's scan flood? So, it's scan flood. And we start with avoiding the word control because flood should not be controlled. It should be managed. We have to live with it. And our aim is to assess the effect and effectiveness of the structure at catchment scale, recognizing the cumulative impacts as discussed by John, cumulative impacts in space and time, and to answer the question, is it the right project in the right place at the right time? And hopefully they will use the decision criteria and the framework towards sustainable and science, data, and evidence-based flood and river management. We have developed some pillars here, which I can also share with you, but we aim for from isolated project level completion to system scale flood management decisions. All right. So before I end, I want to thank all the organizers and my fellow speakers and of course everyone here and everyone in Zoom for this opportunity again. Thank you for making this event possible. Of course, this is not also possible. This presentation would not be possible without my supervisors, collaborators, mentors, project partners, and funders. So I began this talk by asking, what if rivers could speak? After all this, I think the river would not simply ask for more walls, higher embankments, or deeper channels. It would ask us to understand the system, would ask us to look upstream and downstream, ask us to pay attention to sediment, floodplains, communities, and time. It would not ask us not whether a project was completed, but whether it was the right project in the right place or at the right time. And perhaps most importantly, it would remind us that floods are not only events to recover from. They are signals from a landscape that is changing and from river systems that are responding to the way we manage them. So for the Philippines and many parts of Southeast Asia, the challenge is not simply to control rivers, the challenge is to build the knowledge, institutions, and courage to lead rivers more intelligently. That means moving from isolated projects to connected system, from flood control to flood management, from short-term fixes to long-term resilience, and from seeing rivers as stress to seeing rivers as living infrastructure. If we can make that shift, then rethinking flood risk is not only a scientific task, it is a public responsibility. With that, I thank you for listening. Maraming salamat po.
Many thanks for a super interesting and very intricate presentation in which you gave all of us here and watching by Zoom a really rich, complex sense of your research experience and the complexities of your analysis of river management. Why don't we open it up to questions? We have a full half an hour, thanks to your time management, your river management and time management. So we may have some questions coming in from Zoom that Petra can help with, but why don't we just allow people to speak from the floor and you handle it yourself. Okay. Questions?
Thank you, John. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and I just wanted to say, echoing John's words, you've done a really convincing job of showcasing the value of thinking as a river for flood management.
So thank you for that. It's not working. You can hear me now.
Yeah.
I guess my question is more oriented towards the latter part of your presentation on the governance question. And I guess I wanted to hear from your perspective, like maybe we focus even on the moment, like the moment of the past year and a half in the Philippines right now. Like what do you think is like the uptake or interest in adopting a more nature-based approach to flood management? Like, have you seen any uptake of the kind of scan flood documents, and if so, at at kind of what scale? I'm quite curious to know like how like DPWH or DNR or local governments have been engaging with the work that you're doing. So I do a lot of work in Cebu, and I've just come back last week from Cebu, and the discussion, very sadly, is on like building dams for them and
I
that.
heard,
So
yeah.
like, yeah, I was just curious to get a sense from you on like to push you on the governance question and to get a sense on any cracks maybe, or yeah, your reading of like the space for nature-based approaches to flood management in the current moment.
Yeah. Thank you. What's your name?
Jordana.
Jordana, hello. We just missed each other. 2 weeks ago, I was in Cebu, doing the Cebu climate action part. But with your question, last year the president stopped all funding in building up this flood control structure, and that opened a lot of possibility of looking at alternatives in flood control. So the DNR, as mentioned earlier, that the DNR mandates is now I think they commissioned, or the ABTV is helping them or assisting the DNR in looking at the possibility of these alternative solutions, such as nature-based solutions, not only reforestation, but giving more space for the restoration ponds, enhancing groundwater infiltration or groundwater recharge. And the DPWH is now under reform, as I've mentioned to John. So we are actually, the scan flood that you saw earlier will be supporting the DPWH in this reform by giving them or by presenting a different decision criteria. Right now, the planning, the implementation, the evaluation is all under DPWH. And there's no check and balance in this kind of system. But now we are trying to reform the policy in designing this project, because this project, usually the projects are done in isolation. Like they don't consider what's happening, how much structures are already built in one river. And now we are kind of promoting that, looking at the whole system first and what's already in there. So I hope there is, the project is only for a year, but we're also working with, for example, the Asia Foundation Incorporated to have this reform in policy. But for Cebu, yes, the dams are what they're. May I ask what institute or government or?
I'm based at UCL, University College London, but I work with I do a lot of work with community organizations and civil society and aspects of local government, mostly around people living in danger zones. It's very kind of urban focused. I worked with the neighborhood that you pictured there in Talisay, along the Mananagat. So yeah, I'm kind of spanning the community-based organizing and community-based disaster risk management with kind of local government interventions. If I could ask a very brief follow-up, very brief.
Sure.
Can you maybe comment more generally on the role of local government in like this? Because I think the catchment is at a big level, but the Philippines is so decentralized in their kind of governance landscape and the application of legislation for everything. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on scope for engagements in this space and in some piece of the catchment question from a local government perspective. If you have any examples where LGUs or some dimension of the catchment, like a river-based approach to flood management has been successfully adopted in anywhere in the Philippines at any scale.
I'm not sure about successfully adopting, but I remember John asking me, if you have one, what would you do? Because if we are to promote catchment scale approach, someone has to lead it or someone has to oversee it. But as you mentioned, it is, I mean, LGUs don't talk. Even if they're in the same catchments, they do not talk, and they sometimes do something that kind of worsen the situation in the downstream catchment. But and I've seen a lot of problems in that. They have this 2 out of 3 if there's a project being built in their catchment, you only need 2 signatures from the governor or from the barangay captain, that could bypass the LGU. So sometimes they're the affected ones, but they don't have any say on the decision making. So yes, you pinpointed another problem that's being faced in the Philippines. But thank you for your work as well. I hope to see you in Cebu one of these days. Yes.
Okay. Probably don't need this.
Working for the people in mind.
Oh, yes. Okay, thanks so much for your compelling presentation. So just to mention that, a river runs through this area, for example, and then a lot of communities living this side, while, other cities living on this side, for example. But then a certain kind of development dynamics that can play in this area will impact the others, right? It's kind of a lot of stories around upstream and downstream interconnections and impacts, for example. In so many cases, when flood happens in one side, and so many efforts has been taken by the local governments for communities in addressing flooding, for example, and it kind of very disconnected with the others, for example. And for example, here in this case, cities are trying to build a lot of kind of protective systems or protect the urban settlers, for example, without focusing or coordinating with the others.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, so they kind of looking at the whole system, this kind of fragmenting, okay, in terms of flood governance, for example. So I find that is very common across different places, including the Vietnamese Mekong Delta. Do you think that is a challenge in the context of the Philippines? What happens in rural areas impacts, the urban cities, for example, and what is the role of, nature-based solutions or being combination with other approaches like blue or green infrastructure on together. So what's your thought about it?
Yes, it's very much happening in the Philippines. I think that challenge is also really evident in the cases that I presented here. And water knows no boundaries. So it's just a catchment. That's why we're promoting a catchment scale thinking, a system scales thinking, so that if you get to account for what's happening upstream, if it will affect anyone downstream, and actually vice versa. If you put up a dam and then flood the upstream, so this system scales thinking is also a challenge because we don't have a body that is. We have river basin control office, we have river basin management councils, but I would say at this point they don't have teeth or feet to make decisions for people. So yes. Really a challenge for, I remember doing a workshop. I just posted I pasted one catchment map and I asked them, okay, put all the activities you've been doing in the catchment. And so some people, the foresters, pasted notes on the upstream, some the midstream and downstream. And that was the first time they knew about the activities being done upstream. So if we are to really address the flood risk without transfer, I've said, as I've said earlier, flooding is also shaped by how we decide who to flood, and I mean why are we the ones deciding that, who to flood and who to protect? But if there's some kind of system scale thinking, and then we minimize the risk for everyone. Did I answer your
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fanny, for a very interesting presentation. When you asked if anyone here has been to the Philippines, and I feel ashamed that I haven't been there, and there would be an opportunity for me to also come to your beautiful country. Yeah, I'm wondering about one point that you mentioned at the end of your presentation is about the importance of acknowledging community as a knowledge holder, especially linking back to nature-based solutions. The whole idea of nature-based solutions, it's a new concept, but it's actually not. I mean, communities have already been doing it for generations, right? It's just because we name it as nature-based solutions. And because I don't know context of the Philippines, so I was wondering if you can explain a bit more about what kind of local knowledge that would be beneficial for policy uptake, especially when one talks about nature-based solutions.
Yes, actually, the inspiration for doing the paper, the research output too, is that sometimes we feel very intimidated with the word nature-based solution because it sounds technical, but really we are already doing that. We're not just tagging it as nature-based solutions. For example, in the Philippines, south of the Philippines, they have been planting bamboos along the banks of the river, and it serves as a riverbank protection for them. But they were doing it primarily for livelihood because bamboo toothbrushes, bamboo everything, and but not knowing that I mean that kind of sense of they're owning it, they're protecting it, and so the river never floods them, or the river never caused any destruction to them. So these are just small examples, or this is just an example of how, yes, we're doing bamboo. They know that the roots kind of protect the banks from eroding and even before the satellite or the river mobility work has been done, local I think indigenous people already know that, oh yeah, the river shifted the course uh 10 years ago, and it's been shifting quite more often now than before, and so those things that really motivate some of our research, those interviews. So what are your observations in the river, and then we take notes. Okay, how do we kind of have an evidence on
A question up here.
The only one with microphone. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I come from a completely different background, so this is very informative for me. But I had a chance to work a bit in France on the River Seine, more from the historical perspective. And I just wonder, because obviously you advocate for letting the nature, giving it a space, letting it be, which means not building the walls to confine it. But somehow I just wonder, for example, for the River Seine, 80% of it is artificialized, and that has been going on since mid-19th century. So I just wonder, in the context of rivers that are already so transformed by the human activity, how do you undo it? Because obviously, while they're being transformed, like you have the acquisition as well, those areas are being developed for industrial purposes, etc. So I just wonder, maybe dreaming, how does that, the unmaking of this looks like?
So yes, good question. We heard about the room for the river concept in the Netherlands, and that before they used to channelize all the rivers and to assert their control on these rivers, and same with the Seine in France. Unfortunately, some of the rivers cannot have that space back. But actually acknowledging what we're doing, or what are the impacts on river and the whole system when we put up dikes. So I'm not antagonizing any engineering structure. Some are really, really essential, especially in the downstream areas, because floodplains are really convenient to build. I mean, you don't have any intervention, but floodplains are floodplains. I mean, called floodplains for a reason. They are space to be flooded. I mean, those are part of the rivers. But I think it's too late for us to when we recognize that, or when we learn, oh yes, the reason why we're being flooded is that we're on the floodplain. But not all rivers are already channelized. Not all rivers are walled. Not all rivers have this structure. So we still have time to save these rivers, to learn from the lessons that we saw, that we learned from the rivers that are stronger, if I may say. So yes, so maybe that. we cannot do anything in some ways, but we can still do something for other rivers to not end up with the same fate or same path that these rivers.
I have a question or a couple questions, I guess. The way we set up the order of presentations today begins with the island Southeast Asian countries of the Philippines and Indonesia, with the mainland countries left for the afternoon. And if you think of mainland Southeast Asia, it's well known for its large scale rivers and river plains around which, huge rice growing sort of conurbations and broader, population density emerged. Whereas in island Southeast Asia, you have smaller sort of riverine polities and sort of catchment areas and then, coastal towns evolving to cities historically. But throughout and historically, the downstream folks colonize and conquer the upstream folks, economically and politically, and yet it's more fragmented in island Southeast Asia. So as you mentioned, this long list of rivers that you identified and catchment areas, and then this incredibly long list of acronyms from government agencies, and buried in there is what you mentioned in response to Thong's question of the DENR RCBO, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources River Basin Control Office, which, as you mentioned in response to Thong's question, is a very weak body because it spans a whole set of local government units. It doesn't correspond neatly to provinces and so forth. So it's potentially everything, but in reality, it's nothing in terms of having real authority and having any kind of overarching capacity to manage anything or anyone. So is one major implication of your findings, your research, your analysis, your arguments that really there should be a strengthening of some government agency on the basis of a river rather than a province, rather than a municipality, that should be a governing principle for water management. And in relation to that, I think you've just seen the passage, or perhaps the imminent or unprecedented possibility of passage of the National Land Use Act, right? Which would be a reform of land governance in the Philippines in terms of planning and restrictions on certain forms of, land usage. And I don't know if that act takes into consideration river management. And in terms of thinking of possible reforms, would this be the way to go? And if so, how could that possibly work if you waved your magic wand?
Thank you, John. That was the first question. RBCO, yes, strengthening RBCO. There is a bill. I'm not sure if it has been passed, but a creation of the Department of Water Resources in the Philippines, and so hopefully this is kind of the answer to governing water resources more sustainably and more holistically. And for the National Land Use Act, I've mentioned earlier, one of the policy recommendations is to use the river mobility to review the legal easement law, because the legal easement law states that in urban areas there should be 3 meters no build zone. But of course, you've seen most of you have seen the Philippines, a Pasig River, right there. There are houses being built or houses built there. Yes, and in Cebu, the Butuanan River, right after the flooding, houses have been already on the banks that has been cleared. So hopefully the National Land Use Act can, I mean, something that we can also influence, or we can make the river, make space for the river into policy. I've mentioned that an advocate of making space for Philippine rivers, not in this physically, but also into policy, because river basin master plans look at the river as big, small, dirty, clean, but never looking at what it means and what it wants and what should be done to manage it. So it's just a section of the master plan, but never looking at the history, what's happening, what's happening, and yeah, it's how it should be managed. Happy to hear more about the national land use.
Just on that point, it also refers to the earlier question about Cebu. I really wonder whether, and you stressed that, you know, all rivers are different and all have their specific problems. Is it foolish to try and do this through central government agencies? And that inevitably, in my view, will lead to corruption. Whereas, you know, if you decentralize and, you know, maybe setting up new, not necessarily not government organizations at the local level, but perhaps these are the best sort of government structures to work through, local governments and NGOs to the extent they're prepared and able to get involved.
Right. Yes, there are regional development councils that exist. They make the LGUs talk, but when you talk to LGUs, they're not being invited. Sometimes some LGUs are not being invited in this regional development councils. Yes, I think the problem in the Philippines is the coordination between agencies. So they don't talk. So for example, the master plan for flood management and master plan of the river management, you cannot see any they're being implemented by different agencies. They're being commissioned by different agencies, and so yes,
They don't work together. They
no.
don't collab. That is problem in a cause.
They don't collaborate. They don't coordinate.
Just that.
Yes. And for example, the flood control fiasco happened because no one's checking what's DPWH is doing. For example, once implemented, they will do the plans, they will do the construction, or hire their own company to do the construction, and then they will assess, they will check, okay, this has been done. So those
Yeah, but that sort of problem is not specific to the Philippines.
yes,
It happens virtually everywhere, even in the so-called developed countries. And you only got to look at the history of HS2 in this country. Today is yet another inquiry is calling it a gold-plated folly. And, you know, billions of pounds of the taxpayers' money have been wasted. Yes. And if it can happen here, it's far more likely to happen in countries which have inevitably, because they're poorer, they have weaker government systems. You know, you give these agencies vast sums of money, no audit facilities, nothing to check up on what they do. Of course there's going to be corruption. How can there not be?
My impression with the flood control projects that have been revealed to be so corrupt is that on the side of elected officials, it's congresswomen rather than mayors and governors, to speak to your point of decentralization, so that it's in Congress rather. These projects are not really developed with the local government. So in terms of the decentralization with local government units rather than with the Congress.
the influence of congressmen in these projects, because they have the funds.
Yeah.
And so they dictate what projects,
Mm.
in that case, with or without funds.
Yeah, I guess the issue of decentralization is not as easy as giving powers and money to the local government. I think, especially, I don't know the other countries' case, but in Indonesia, it cannot be disentangled then from national politics. If it's just too powerfully inherent, no matter how much it is influenced, it just keeps in the different pockets, depending power relations still there. And maybe also another point I wanted to make is maybe the role of high bureaucracy in the Southeast Asian countries. So maybe little room to actually change some things. Because if you want to change something, you have to change so many different laws, regulations, and then maybe you will be indicted because you want to change something. So I think it's very wicked in that sense.
We've been pushing to integrate rivers out, even with the recognition that there are different types of rivers. It's taking us like forever to put that into policy. I had a very good question because it was interesting when you were showing the historical maps, and I never really realized how much the river can actually shift over time. And some of those images were really incredible. But I was wondering, with the climate change and perhaps the more unpredictable nature of how, I mean, you know, this is also related to rainfall and all the other things. How accurate can you be in trying to predict the future? Because I think, you know, if you're going to implement certain solutions, let's say, you know, through this more kind of river management system or approach, and if it doesn't work because, you know, there comes something related to climate that is not expected, or, you know, we're not really necessarily prepared for, like people might then think, well, okay, this approach doesn't work as well. So how can you sort of try and predict and sort of prepare for something that, you know, we might, you know, it might not map to the extent of what was true, you know, maybe 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years ago.
Yes. So just for that, and I think you're talking about like the mobility of rivers and recognizing the valley setting, like for example, the natural system that dictates how it behaves. Like for example, in those settings that are unconfined, and so you know the range of lateral adjustment that the river can do. So you don't build just 10 meters, I mean, from the river, you know that it can move. Well, in confined valley settings, you just have to worry about vertical adjustment. When the rain comes, the typhoon comes, the discharge goes up, then it will just the water level will just rise or recede. But for partly confined, you know, you have these floodplains, and these floodplains are can host the river, and the river can shift it in this area. And so yeah. So regardless of, I mean, the Philippines has an average of 20 typhoons, and these typhoons can really shift rivers, and they're very dramatically effective in shifting rivers, shifting the sediments. And so you kind of already know the range of behavior, the range of adjustment that the rivers can do, given the high discharge that the climate change or so yes, recognizing the different settings, the different factors, natural factors of this.